The morning my son Brendan showed up at my door, with a woman I'd never seen before and a manila envelope tucked under his arm, I knew exactly what was happening. I just didn't let him know that I knew. That's the thing about getting older. People assume your eyes are going. They assume your memory is going. They assume that because you move a little slower, and you don't always catch the punchline of their jokes the first time, that you've somehow become easier to fool. Brendan had been operating under that assumption for about 8 months by the time he stood on my front porch that Tuesday morning in February, the snow still coming down hard off Georgian Bay, stamping his boots like he was doing me a favor, just by showing up. I'm 71 years old. I spent 34 years as a civil engineer for the Ministry of Transportation in Ontario. I built bridges, not metaphorically. Actual bridges that people drive across every day without thinking about the tensile strength of the steel or the load-bearing calculations that went into every bolt. I know how things hold together, and I know exactly how they fall apart. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it really started. My wife Patricia passed away 4 years ago just before Easter. Pancreatic cancer. We had 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end, which sounds merciful until you're the one living through it. Sitting in a hospital room in Barrie watching the woman you've spent 42 years disappear a little more each day. After she was gone, I rattled around our house in Collingwood for about a year, not really knowing what to do with myself. Patricia had been the one who kept the social calendar, the one who remembered which neighbors to wave at, which friends to call on birthdays. Without her, I found myself spending a lot of evenings alone, reading, watching the hockey game, going to bed early. Brendan is our youngest. We have 2 kids. Brendan, who's 43 now, and our daughter Lynette, who lives in Vancouver with her husband and their 2 girls. Lynette called every Sunday without fail. She flew out in the spring and in the fall to visit. She never once asked me about the house, about the RRSP accounts, about what I was planning to do with the cottage up near Huntsville that Patricia and I had owned since 1998. Brendan, on the other hand, had been going through a rough stretch. He and his wife Diane had separated, then divorced, in the 2 years after his mother died. He'd been living in a condo in Oakville, working in commercial real estate, and from what I could piece together, the market had not been kind to him. He called more often than he used to, which I initially took as a good sign. A son reconnecting with his father after a hard period. I was glad to hear from him. It took me a while to notice the pattern. Every few calls he'd steer the conversation toward money. Not obviously, he was never crude about it. He'd ask how I was getting on with the house, whether I found it too big to manage on my own. He asked once, casually, whether I'd thought about downsizing. Another time he mentioned a friend of his who'd moved his father into an independent living community in Barrie, and how much happier the old man was, not having to worry about maintenance. He asked, just offhandedly, whether I had a financial advisor, whether Patricia and I had updated our wills after she was diagnosed. I answered him, vaguely. I told him things were fine, that I had people helping me, that I wasn't ready to think about any of that yet. What I didn't tell him was that I'd already spoken to my lawyer. I should explain something about my situation. Patricia and I were not wealthy by any stretch of the word wealthy that gets used in magazines. But we had been careful. We had paid off the mortgage on the Collingwood house in 2009. We had contributed steadily to our RRSPs since our 30s. We had the cottage. Patricia had a small pension from the school board where she'd worked as an administrator for 15 years. Put together, the picture was comfortable. Not extravagant. Comfortable. The kind of comfortable that you build quietly over a lifetime without making noise about it. I had never made noise about it. That was just how we were raised, Patricia and I both. You didn't talk about money at the table. You didn't broadcast what you had. You were grateful and you were careful, and you didn't assume the good times would last forever. I think, somewhere along the line, Brendan had started to do his own math. The thing that shifted something in me, the thing that moved this from a nagging feeling to something colder and more certain, was a phone call I got from my friend Alistair in November. Alistair and I had worked together at the ministry for over 20 years. He's sharp, Alistair. Retired now, lives just outside Owen Sound, spends most of his time fishing and arguing with his wife about the thermostat. He called me on a Thursday afternoon and started the conversation the way Alistair always does, with absolutely no preamble. Did you know your son called the credit union? I told him I did not know that. Alistair said that his daughter worked in member services at the branch I'd used for 30 years. And she had mentioned, not by way of gossip, but because she thought Alistair should pass it along, that a man had called asking about accounts held by a member with my name. He had represented himself as a family member. The branch had not disclosed anything. They had procedure for that, but the inquiry had been logged. I sat with that for a long time after Alistair hung up. I want to be careful here about what I say about my son, because despite everything, he is still my son, and I have not stopped loving him. But what I understood in that moment was that something had shifted in how he saw me. I had become in his mind a problem to be managed, a set of assets to be positioned. An old man who could be moved around like a piece on a board if you were patient enough and if you had the right paperwork. The paperwork part worried me most. I called my lawyer the next morning. His name is Grant, and he had handled Patricia's estate, and has been my personal solicitor for going on 12 years. I told him what Alistair had told me. I told him about the pattern of conversations with Brendan. I told him I didn't know exactly what was coming, but I wanted to be ready. Grant listened, asked a few questions, and then said something I've thought about many times since. He said, "The best position you can be in is one where there's nothing left to contest." We spent 2 hours on the phone that afternoon going through everything. We made some changes to documents. We updated some designations. We had a conversation about power of attorney that I should have had years earlier, and which we resolved clearly and in writing. And then I waited. The waiting was the hardest part, not because I was afraid. I had made my peace with whatever was coming. It was hard because I kept looking at Brendan's name on my phone when he called, and trying to square the boy I remembered. The kid who used to fall asleep in the back seat on the drive home from the cottage, who cried at his mother's funeral in a way that broke something open in me, with the person who had called my bank branch pretending to be acting on my behalf. I don't know how you hold those two things at once. I still don't, if I'm honest. He called in January to say he was going to come visit. He had some things he wanted to go over with me. Estate stuff, he said. Just to get everything organized, so I wouldn't have to worry. He said he'd bring someone who could help. I said that would be fine. And I told him to come on a Tuesday, and I gave him the address of the house like he hadn't grown up there. What I didn't mention was that I'd also made a phone call of my own. I want to talk about Frances for a moment, because she deserves that. Frances Kimura had been a neighbor of ours on this street for almost as long as we'd lived here. She's 68, recently retired from a career as a paralegal, 30 years working for a firm in Toronto that dealt primarily in estate law. She knows more about the legal mechanics of estate transfers, powers of attorney, and elder financial abuse than most lawyers I've spoken to. Her husband passed away 6 years ago. We'd been close with her and Douglas for decades. After he died, Patricia and I used to have her over for dinner on Sundays, and after Patricia passed, Frances kept coming. Not out of obligation. We'd become genuine friends in our own right. She brought soup when I had a chest infection in November 2 years ago. I drove her to her cardiology appointment in Barrie last spring when her car was in the shop. She had been following what I'd been telling her about Brendan with a quiet attention that I recognized as professional concern. When I told her what I was planning, she didn't hesitate. She said, "I'll be there." That Tuesday in February, Frances arrived at my house at 9 in the morning. She sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, and we talked about the birds at the feeder for a while. There was a pair of blue jays that had been coming around all winter, very bold, very loud. And then we moved into the living room and waited. Brendan and the woman arrived at 11. I opened the door before they could knock. The woman was somewhere in her mid-40s, dark coat, briefcase. She introduced herself as Sandra Whitmore. She had the practiced handshake and the careful smile of someone who does this for a living, whatever this turned out to be. Brendan was wearing a jacket I didn't recognize. New, the kind of thing you'd wear to a business meeting. He kissed me on the cheek and called me Dad and said, I looked good, which is what people say when they haven't seen you in 4 months and they want you to feel at ease. I told them to come in, and I offered them coffee, and I behaved exactly the way I imagined they expected me to behave. I moved a little slowly, getting the cups down from the cabinet. I asked Sandra to repeat her name once. I asked Brendan how the drive down from Oakville had been, and then, 30 seconds later, asked him if the roads were bad coming in from Barrie. Little things. Nothing that would alarm anyone. Nothing that wasn't within the range of a man my age on a Tuesday morning. We sat in the living room. Brendan glanced toward the kitchen. I think he was checking to see if I was alone. He was not expecting to find Frances sitting in the armchair beside the fireplace with her reading glasses on and a notepad in her lap. I watched his face. I had been waiting for that specific moment for 2 months, and I want to be honest about what I felt when I saw it. Not satisfaction exactly, but something like recognition. The recognition of a person realizing that the situation they thought they had control over is not the situation they are actually in. Sandra Whitmore's reaction was subtler, but I caught it too. A very brief stillness, a recalibration. I said, Brendan, you know Frances. Sandra, this is Frances Kimura. She was a paralegal specializing in estate law for 30 years. She's here as my advocate. The word advocate was Grant's suggestion. It's a good word. Precise, but open. It tells you exactly what you need to know without explaining more than necessary. Brendan said hello to Francis like he was clearing something from the back of his throat. Francis smiled at him, unhurried, and wrote something on her notepad. She told me later it was nothing, just something to look busy. But the effect was considerable. Sandra began. She had a folder of documents. She placed them on the coffee table in front of me and explained, in a tone that was professionally warm, that these were some materials she had prepared to help me think about planning for the future. The language was careful. Phrases like protecting your assets going forward, and ensuring your wishes are carried out, and giving your family peace of mind. There was a power of attorney document. There was something relating to the sale of property, the Huntsville cottage. There was a document I didn't immediately understand, which I let sit on the table in front of me without picking up. Frances leaned forward. She said in a voice that was entirely pleasant, "Sandra, could you tell me which firm you're with?" Sandra told her. Frances asked if she was a licensed paralegal or a lawyer, and what her specific designation was with the Law Society of Ontario. There was a pause. Frances said that she asked because the document relating to the power of attorney didn't appear to have been commissioned by the person whose interests it was meant to represent, and that under Ontario legislation, specifically the Substitute Decisions Act, there were some procedural requirements she wanted to make sure had been followed, and that she would like to see Sandra's capacity to act on behalf of anyone present before they went any further. The temperature in the room changed. What I noticed was Brendan. He had stopped looking at me. He was looking at the carpet, which is a pattern Patricia chose in 2011, and which I have always found somewhat busy, but I'd never had the heart to change. He was looking at it the way you look at something when you can't look at anything else. Sandra said that she had not been retained by me. Frances said that was exactly what she'd thought, and that in that case she wanted to understand who had retained Sandra and toward what end. Because from where she was sitting, several of these documents appeared to be intended to create legal authority over my assets that I had not requested, and that she would recommend, as my advocate, that I not sign anything today, and that I speak to my own solicitor, whose number Frances had in front of her if Sandra needed to make contact. Brendan said my name. I looked at him. He said, "Dad, I'm just trying to help you. I'm worried about you. We're all worried. The house is too big, you're up here alone, you don't have anyone." I said, "I have Frances." He didn't have an answer for that. The silence in the room was long enough that I could hear the blue jays at the feeder outside the window. That bold, argumentative sound they make. I've always liked it. Sandra began gathering her documents back into the folder. She did it quietly and efficiently. She thanked me for my time. She said something to the effect that she hoped I understood. This had all been motivated by genuine concern. I thanked her for coming and did not say anything else about that. Brendan stood up. He looked in that moment like someone who had walked into a room expecting something to be there and found that it had already been moved. Not anger, exactly. More like disorientation, the specific disorientation of a plan that has collapsed before it fully existed. He said he'd be in touch. I walked him to the door. We stood on the porch for a moment, the two of us, the snow still coming down, and I looked at my son. My youngest, the one who used to fall asleep in the car on the way home from Huntsville, who cried at his mother's funeral, and I said, "The accounts are protected, Brendan. The cottage has been dealt with. The house has been dealt with. Everything has been dealt with. I'm not telling you this to be cruel. I'm telling you so that we can stop having this particular conversation, and maybe eventually go back to having different ones." He didn't say anything. He walked to his car. Sandra Whitmore was already waiting in the passenger seat. He backed out of the driveway and turned onto the street and drove away, and I stood there until I couldn't see the car anymore. When I went back inside, Frances was in the kitchen putting the kettle on. She asked if I was all right. I said I thought I probably was, and that I might not be for a little while, but that I would be eventually. She said that sounded about right. We had tea and we watched the blue jays at the feeder, and she stayed for lunch, and neither of us talked about Brendan very much. We talked about her grandnephew in Calgary who was learning to skate, and about a documentary she'd been watching about the Cambrian period, and about whether the weather had been harder this winter than last. It was an ordinary afternoon. I was grateful for that more than I can say. That was 3 months ago now. Brendan and I have spoken twice since then, both times brief. Polite in the way that two people are polite when they are not yet sure what they are to each other. I don't know where it goes from here. I would be lying if I said that didn't hurt. It does. It is a specific kind of hurt, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly but that you find, at odd moments. Putting on the kettle in the morning, sitting down in the chair where Patricia used to sit, sitting just under the surface of an otherwise ordinary day. My daughter Lynette knows what happened. I told her in March when she called on a Sunday. She was quiet for a long time and then she said, "I'm sorry, Dad. Not sorry for Brendan, not making excuses. Just sorry that her father had had to go through it." That landed differently than I expected. Grief for what your family could have been, alongside gratitude for what it actually is. You can hold both, I've learned. It just takes some practice. I updated my will in January. Grant handled everything. The cottage, as I told Brendan, has been dealt with. The house is dealt with. The accounts have beneficiary designations that are clear and cannot be reassigned without my explicit authorization, which I am still entirely capable of giving. My power of attorney, for property and for personal care, is held by two people I trust completely. Neither of them is my son. If there's anything I want someone to take from this, it's not about the money. The money, honestly, was never the point. The point is that getting older does not mean surrendering your judgment. The world will sometimes look at you, at the gray in your hair, at the pace of your walk, at the careful way you lower yourself into a chair, and decide that you have become a problem to be administered rather than a person to be respected. Don't let it. Know what you have. Know who holds your documents. Know who is asking questions about you, and why, and to whom. Keep your eyes open. Keep your people close. And if a man calls your bank branch asking questions about your accounts, get yourself a good lawyer and a sharper friend, and make sure you're ready before they come knocking. I poured the rest of my tea down the sink, put my coat on, and went out to fill the bird feeder. The blue jays were back almost before I'd finished, loud and certain and entirely at home. I stood in my backyard in the February snow and watched them, and thought that Patricia would have liked that very much.